Chandran Nair, welcome to BRI Dialogues. It's been long in the making, and we're delighted to have you with us. Chandran is a prolific author, and his latest book, Understanding China, Governance, Socioeconomics, Global Influence, will be published later this year. Chandran, when President Trump uses this phrase, you don't have the cards, you don't have the cards, irrespective of whom he's talking with, what are the cards that both parties have and hold between China and United States? And where is this card gaming and playing heading to? And what are the aces that China may be presenting and putting on the table in the coming months?
Thank you, Ali. I first arrived in China in the early part of 1990, and most of the people were traveling in bicycles and Mao suits. And then I look at China today, and I would define it as a miracle. What's happened in the space of about 35 years, at least that's what I saw. Being based out of Hong Kong and traveled hundreds of times to China, I've observed all those different stages of the transformation, and it is a social miracle. So to come to your point about the cards, but let's remember that card game requires two willing participants. And in this card game, there's only one entity that said, let's have a card game, and the card game is going to end up in a zero-sum game. And I win and you must lose. And I think anyone who understands China understands that China doesn't play these games. It doesn't see it and its interaction with others as a zero-sum game. And this is not to say that the Chinese don't have their own self-interests. They don't have differences with countries in the region and elsewhere, but they don't see the geopolitical game being played this way. So when the current administration talks about we have the cards in our hand, I think the Chinese response is, well, we are not playing the same game. But if you do seek to harm us, then we will do what is needed to protect us. And I think you will know when the Americans threw 150% tariffs on the Chinese. And remember, this is the second Trump administration. The first Trump administration tried all of that, tried certain parts of imposing sanctions and various things on China. China was much stronger. And China is now weaker in terms of the economic growth, etc., but it's much more resilient, and we can talk about that. So when they threw that on China, they thought, like most of the other countries, much weaker, much smaller, and much more subservient, would sort of negotiate. As you know, China said, okay, you 150, I got 152. And that's how they responded it. But when the Trump administration in 2018, the first time the Americans started playing the card game and thinking we could hurt you, the Chinese exports to the US were about 20% of their total. In 2023, it was down to 12%. So both sides, depending again on your ideological biases, listeners can go and Google, we'll see all kinds of different decks of cards being played out. But I think we should be talking about Chinese resilience and how China has responded and how it has changed the Chinese view on its own economy, energy, food security, and all of that, and its relationship with the rest of the world. And like it or not, the opportunities it has created for China to engage with a world that has essentially been awakened to the sort of irresponsible, unpredictable nature of the US government.
We are now looking at China providing a kind of I would like to call it more moral leadership, but diplomatic leadership for a post-American order in which priorities will have to change dramatically. And Europe seems to be caught up in that. Could you tell us a bit about what's happening in China's own hinterland in that regard, and whether you have any views on how China may see European transition in a post-Trump world?
Thank you. Very simply put, I think the Americans openly have come to the conclusion that the Americans have shot themselves in the foot. People like me, I'm from Southeast Asia. I was born in Malaysia. My formative political views were shaped by the Vietnam War. And I always saw the American desire and need to use force indiscriminately as something that, for me as a young person at that time, suggested there was something wrong with the nature of international relations and the body politics of the United States. Today, I realize it's US exceptionalism. Some might call it white supremacy that discards the lives of others. So Donald Trump has done us all a great service, in my view. He has essentially said, we're Americans, we're supremacists, and no one can challenge that. And then, as you said, in contrast, the world looks at the Chinese president who doesn't espouse all of this sort of nonsense, even in Chinese. Because Donald Trump speaks in the language of the global mass media, which is English, and it gets channeled into all our rooms, etc. The kind of tyranny of English sort of problem. The Chinese president doesn't speak in English, but even internally would never utter these words because it's not in their way of behaving and showing leadership. So it shows the decay in the sort of American body politics. And he's not the only one. You can see the vice president, the foreign secretary, etc. So the rest of the world's looking at this and saying, hey, here is someone else. And now China is respected because of through its achievements, not military might sanctioning others, just achievements. And people are saying, there is a different form of leadership. This man is speaking about a global governance initiative, which some of you may have heard of. He's talked about a shared humanity, etc. He has had this vision of the One Belt, One Road, development as peace, and all of those things. He senses this, and some of us are feeling it. So I think that is clear in the rest of the world. China is not perfect, but it's not an imperial power seeking to dominate and punish, etc. I come from Southeast Asia. There are issues with the South China Sea, but China is not taking over stretches of the Philippines, Indonesia, or my own country because they have the might. So the rest of the world is very keen to engage. And I think this is where Europe is lost. The UK Prime Minister yesterday was at a press conference with Donald Trump, and the question of Gaza was raised. And he said something to the effect that we can never, ever have peace or a two-state solution with Hamas involved. Donald Trump stood hovering over him and then patted him on his back and said, good, very good, almost dictating to him. You said what I told you to say, didn't you, boy? And so I think Europe is in a very difficult state. And I think Europe needs to decide that it should not continue to harbor this romantic view of a special transatlantic alliance with America. For the rest of the world, Europe needs to realize the world has changed. And I've said decouple from the United States, at least on foreign policy, have its own foreign policy. It's a long history and many things that many of us around the world look upon and respect, and form its own foreign policy that allows it to essentially mend fences to China, other parts of the world, and very importantly, reframe its foreign policy in the Middle East away from the United States. So I think Europe needs leadership, and that's what's lacking. And until there's better leadership in Europe, nothing changes. And I don't see better leadership coming out of the United States for a long time, given they are on this sort of deep decline in terms of the body politics, which seems to be, in a way, steeped in immorality and exceptionalism.
Chandran, thank you for that. Yesterday, in the press conference that you were talking about was coincided with something very important. I wrote a piece on my Substack on Futurely. Pakistan and Saudi Arabia came out and talked about a defense pact. Comprehensive defense pact. And I titled it as a dysfunctional security umbrella and the dash for a security raincoat. So my question to you in that context is a bit broader to the East and the relationship between India and China, which is monumental on the sidelines of SCO, the Global Governance Initiative. Where do you see this dynamic going? Are these two having a dance of just convenience and when India shift again? Or this time this is real, not just because of the tariffs that Donald Trump applied to India, but is there a bigger undercurrent where you are sitting? And in that context, are we seeing the manifestation of something that I've frequently talked about, a détente, a rapprochement, a collaboration between Russia, China, and India? And what would be the ramifications of that for the heartland and the West Asia at large?
Very, very important point. I have for many years said that it's a shame that China and India were not coming together in the way we would want. But I've also said, and I've written about this, that there's an exaggeration in the West that China and India are at loggerheads and are someday going to clash. I don't think this, I said this will never happen because both countries have wisdom, not just within the political elites, but across the nations that will prevent this. I've also argued that China should be the one that actually supports the entry of India into the UN Security Council. And I've had some discussions with diplomats on both sides. But there are lots of complications with this. But to answer your question, my view has been, and I was in India in February, where I had a nice dialogue with the very articulate Shashi Tharoor, and I said that the relationship between China and India would be the most consequential for the 21st century. The inconvenient truth is India does need China from supply chains and all of that. And I think Indian industrialists and etc. know that. But India has also a lot to offer China, as we know. And so it would be consequential in that it would help two of the largest countries in terms of populations to economically and socially develop. But very importantly, it would have a dramatic impact on the subcontinent, particularly Pakistan and Bangladesh. Imagine an economic force that combines India's rising powers and know-how and China's supply chain and resources, that the implications for those two countries, very important countries, by the way, which many people don't fully appreciate, in my view, and essential for creating peace. And if you want to use that word, security for India, Pakistan is a large country, and its population is expected to exceed 350 million or so by the year 2060. You can't have a Pakistan that is in the state it is today. And lots happening in China, to finish up this, is again in one of our virtual conferences, Ali, on the role of China in the One Belt, One Road. We had a very distinguished Pakistani who is very much involved in the One Belt, One Road program talk about the impacts that the One Belt, One Road has had on China, particularly transport, education, etc. That has created tensions in India about what are the Chinese doing in Pakistan. But if China and India cooperated, that tension goes away. And then it automatically brings Pakistan into that heartland of development. And let's not forget Bangladesh. Now, if you put those four countries together, you've got roughly 50% of the world's population. And that is what development is all about. That changes all the dynamics in the world. So I think India and China are serious. And I see it'll be a slow process. But Indians have now come to the conclusion that the Americans can't be trusted. But India is not going to cut its ties with the US, and it should not. And neither do the Chinese want to.
I really want to carry on conversation regarding Asian major powers. Knowing China as you do, how obsessed is China with Persian Gulf oil and gas for its prosperity, security, and economic development? Or have they worked out a formula that doesn't rely entirely on the continuous importation of that kind of fossil fuels from the Persian Gulf?
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just say, Professor, that environmental vandalism is at the center of the need for human beings to develop. The United States, we followed a model of economic growth that essentially externalized all costs and didn't internalize it, and we encouraged consumption relentlessly. So China, when it started redoing this, and this is where I was when I said I was arrived in Beijing in 1990, I mean, the country was polluted would be an understatement. The poverty was extensive. And that economic miracle that I talked to you about includes the cleanup in the last 15 years, especially since the Beijing Olympics. And I just give an example. When I went to Beijing, there was a river that goes through part of Beijing that was so polluted. Last year, when I went there, this is now 25 years, there were people swimming in it. And that's the ability of the state to essentially bring about change on a large-scale method that most countries can't do. To be able to scores of steel mills and industrial plants, you will move, and you will do it in 2 years. And here's where you're going. I don't think there's another country in the world that can do that. So to your question now, in terms of energy consumption, coal is about 55%, right? No imports. So it does import some stuff from the rest of the world, including Australia. Oil and gas is about 21%, imports mostly. And then you have non-fossil, which is about 20%, all domestic. That's hydro, that's wind, that's nuclear. So in a way, there's overcapacity if you put them all together. And there has been criticism of China with regard to its strategy of 2060 net zero carbon and 2030, which is peak emissions of carbon, which many of the experts will tell you they have almost reached or will reach in a couple of years. So when you look at all of what is clear, and that's been analysis done by external experts, energy self-sufficiency rate in China is about 85%. So of course, China will be worried about that. It has also surplus coal-fired. Now, one of the criticisms is building coal. But if you look at it, and this is my hypothesis as well, it is because if push comes to shove, we will burn the coal. And why are we building more nuclear? So that we can be more nuclear self-sufficient. Of course, the Chinese are very sensitive to anything that will require them to burn more dirty coal. Right. But in terms of self-sufficiency, I think they can go. So I hope I've answered your question that the energy self-sufficiency rate is pretty high. And they would not want to see oil supplies diminish. I can assure you there's thousands of energy strategists in China working relentlessly, all the various permutations. And that's why the coal, the nuclear mix, and all of that is part of this overall energy security blanket.
So I agree that self-sufficiency is important, but I get the impression that China is actually using its energy prowess in alternative sources as a measure of its extension of its influence, part of its soft power. Do you see that in Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa as a policy?
Absolutely. It's doing that. It has to be cautious a bit because of its might. It can suffocate local innovation in those same industries, which you do need, but it is doing that. It's also in terms of the optimization technology, which is much digital. So you have companies like Huawei, etc., who are creating incredibly powerful digital tools to enable countries in Africa, Asia, etc., to optimize these systems with digital know-how. I think one of the things that this is soft power, you can call it, but it's also part of China's decoupling. So the decoupling is not simply about the United States and that we just decouple from them. And that the decoupling is essentially was initiated by the US. But China now is switching from development framework of simply talking about economic growth to economic control, meaning control of its own destiny and therefore self-reliance. And that's being done by less reliance on foreign countries and foreign technology, and then support through policy the sort of local firms domestically to be dominant locally. So when they become dominant and large, as you and I know, they become better, there's competition, they scale up, they have more money for R&D, and that allows the third leg of what we're talking about, to then leverage that expansion of these companies, local competition for global expansion as well. And that's where I think the soft power, particularly in terms of green technology, China is leading the world. So this is what the dual circulation is about. The first circulation is the internal circulation. And then when you got those two right, then you have the second circulation, which is the external. But the starting point is, okay, they changed the rules. We thought WTO and all of these things work, but they don't. Okay, we'll go and do our stuff, and we have the capability to do it. So that's really what's happening. And it's turning out, as you say, into soft power, which the rest of the world appreciates in the global majority. But my word of caution to China is that it needs to be sensitive that its expansion in this way does not suffocate in the innovations and industries that need to grow in those countries as well. This is extremely important as well.
Chandran, you brought a word of caution on how China should behave in this area. Another recurring comment these days across the global South, global majority, the other 6.5 billion, is that, hey, you're now the second largest economy, by some counts, the largest economy. You are a global power. Don't you have to move beyond your alignment of political expediency and have a greater role in suffering of smaller nations in conflicts, not as an interventionist, but as somebody who, you know, has this weight to influence, whether it's in Middle East at the moment? How far can China have this Tai Chi mode and, you know, the composure? When will China have to exert some muscle to stop some of these atrocities and hardships and human tragedies, or to be a bit more vocal in protecting its own interest? Where do you see that going? Can you elaborate on that, please?
I'm glad you used the word Tai Chi, because Tai Chi is control. It's all about control, mind and body. And I think on this front, the Chinese are doing Tai Chi, which is often referred to in a derogatory way, but Tai Chi in the positive way. And I know you didn't mean it in a derogatory term, in a way, but so I've thought about this a fair bit. I've had discussions with many Chinese, but if you look at Gaza, and we had a Palestinian analyst in our webinar last week when we discussed China's global role, and he asserted that this is the moment for China to step up. The Chinese, who were on the panels and the two other panels, said there's actually no space. And an Italian friend of mine commented and said, China is playing the wise man's game, not getting involved, but actually there's no space. So if you look at Gaza, I'm also thinking, what can they do? The only thing that is required in here can happen is we used to have a counterweight, or even recently, you know, where we had the Russians say, you can't do that. Beware, we will be there. So I agree with you. I would like to see China, particularly with regard to Gaza, take some sort of role that would help end that tragedy. I can't see what it can do, because the only thing that it can do is get involved in a military sense to stop Israel, America, and its European allies. It has tried everything. It has tried everything in the UN. I'll say one more thing. The Chinese fundamentally believe that the UN is the way. It recognizes that the UN is weak, but it itself doesn't want to do anything that is a departure from the UN, fail, and thereby further weaken the international order. So the thinking is, we stand with the UN, and we have to go. And all the Chinese speakers that we had, without an exception said.
I want to jump in there and stop you for one reason. One is that I'm not talking about military intervention. I'm talking about humanitarian intervention. And when you talk about UN, I think you touched on it, that UN is primed and ovulating for change from Security Council to the rest of it. UN as well, in my opinion, should move to Singapore or to somewhere else. I mean, being in New York today is
It's a disaster.
It's a disaster.
No, I know what you meant. In that particular instance in Gaza, any Chinese attempt to provide humanitarian aid outside the UN system would be difficult for China. A unilateral would be seen as, by the United States and Israel, as a provocation. And I agree with you. I think the Chinese, in my view, want to maintain a good relationship with the United States. They don't want to burn bridges. And they don't want to start something that would essentially worsen the situation. So you're right in saying they could have done more, and I think they could. But my view is they are wedded so much to the principles of the UN. But it's not known, because we are all fed the global media anti-China propaganda, that around the world, where there are humanitarian crises, particularly earthquakes, floods, and other things, China is one of the first to deploy its resources. But I'd agree with you that I would like to see China do more, but I can't speak to the calculations in terms of their fundamental view that the world order requires us to behave within the bounds of what exists today rather than breach it.
And China, as you know, has had very strong interests in Sudan in the past, continues to do, given that Djibouti is just next door, given the importance of the Red Sea for Chinese transport and so on. And yet I see very little Chinese presence in try and moderate there. You hear sometimes Americans blabbing about it. You hear sometimes Europeans talking about it. You know about other Arab countries interfering. But China, which has had an interest in that part of Africa, doesn't appear to be saying anything instrumental. That beyond rhetoric, Chandran, where is this great power's influence felt?
No, I agree with you. I think one of the things that one of the Chinese professors on our forum said, that the way Chinese think and Chinese foreign policy culture is formulated is not properly understood by the rest of the world, because it is in Chinese philosophy and the Chinese language. But what I can say is, I was in Africa during the 80s, during the liberation wars. And Nelson Mandela famously said, when questioned by Americans in the US about why he maintains cordial relationships with the Chinese, the Russians, and the Cubans, he said, when we wanted help, you were not there, but the Cubans, the Chinese, and Russians were there. So I think the Chinese have this view that we have to help. In terms of where they are now, my view is they're still trying to work out how to do this, because in 35 years, they suddenly become this, and they're trying to work it out. They're trying to work it out in a background in which the superpower is saying, you're my enemy, you're a threat to the world. And so I can only imagine, if I was a Chinese policymaker, thinking, how am I going to react? If I enter this complicated situation in Sudan, how do I do this? I will say, and with all due respect to my Chinese friends, I don't think they're very good at communication. But it is not the Chinese game to play propaganda internationally. They only say when we're going to act, and they don't explain it fully. So I think we are in a situation where many of us would like to see China play the more balancing act. But as the Chinese professor and an advisor said, we don't use the word balance either in our foreign policy. It is supporting what exists today and all of that. So it's a complicated situation where non-experts like me can only assume. And I think the fear is that they be led into something very confrontational and drawn into wars. And I think this is the paranoia. We don't want to be drawn into a war.
Chandran, that really weaves nicely to my next question for you. China has now said to many, we don't want NVIDIA imports because we cannot be at the mercy of US sanctioning, banning, etc. When the moment comes that China breaks through and China crosses that bridge technologically on semiconductors, will Taiwan become only a real estate and pride issue? And given the deteriorating and reducing share, in a positive way for China, of exports to the United States, as you rightly said, that is maybe in single digits, what is the relevance of the United States in a China that has mastered the renewables, expanded its trade with Global South, and finalized that last link of semiconductors and chips? Will that still keep China as apprehensive, or is that the last moment? So bring all of this together in the context of relevance of the United States once that bridge is built to technological supremacy as well, and the issue of Taiwan. How badly can US play that card to disrupt China's rise?
I think in terms of Taiwan, most people do not understand that China will not attack Taiwan. As a Chinese good friend of mine said to me, we Chinese will not kill other Chinese. We are not interested, right? So I think there's been a lot of provocation, which if it was the tables were turned,
Yep.
the Americans would have gone to war. But the Chinese will not go to war on this. And I don't think the Chinese want to see Taiwan become some leftover little place of the post-colonial era. I think Chinese want to see Taiwan prosper, just like they want to see Hong Kong prosper. And China has gone out of its way, despite all the provocations and sanctions, etc., to make sure Hong Kong thrives. And for the first time in about 5, 6 years, very positive stories about Hong Kong. But it's more on the financial side. I think we still got a lot to fix on the social side because of the disparities. So what's the relevance of the United States? I don't care, actually, to put it bluntly, because we all want to see the United States as well be successful. But as someone who was born in Malaysia and was politicized, but I thankfully want to think I appreciated at an early age, was essentially war crimes being committed. I'm very happy to see the United States leave our region, because what are they doing here? Imagine a Chinese presence of tens and scores of military bases and Secret Service hideouts throughout Latin America. It would be unthinkable. So I'd like to see the United States stay relevant, mainly to its own people, because as others have said, and Pankaj said the other day, is a low-intensity civil war going on. So we give the United States too much oxygen, in my mind, with regard to its ongoing relevance in the world. It should stay relevant because it's a large, powerful country. It has great institutions which are now being eroded. So we like to see the United States be relevant, but not relevant in the state of being a hegemonic power. And I think we do not want to see China in this part of the world be a hegemonic power either. And I hope we do not come to a point where we say that to China, what are you doing? And I work trying to balance this out in our little contributions at the Global Institute. And part of that is making sure that there's greater understanding of the needs of the region. And China understands also what its limits should be and what it should try and do and fulfill its promise of peaceful rise and shared humanity. And that, I think, is important. And in the United States, because it's a very important country, wants to play and contribute to that world, but not just in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, then that would be the new relevance of the United States, not the game it's playing today, supporting a genocide, supporting Zionists, and then white supremacy all over the world. But I can't shift that. The American people need to shift that.
Well, listen, normally we bring our session to an end with a question to our audience. What is your single most important advice to Sinophobes and to the Sinophiles? So Chandran Nair, one piece of advice for both parties, what would that be? Short and succinct, the way you want it.
Be open-minded. We are entering a new age, and everything's going to be better if we can be open to new ways of thinking and not steeped in the old war, post-colonial era.
Thank you.
Chandran, you've definitely pointed the way to opening our minds to not just new thinking, but new ways of looking at the world in which we live and the world in which we all have a major stake in. And we couldn't have got those pearls of wisdom from anybody else but yourself. So we are really, really grateful to you for kicking off our new season with such a rich set of ideas and comments, analysis. Thank you, Chandran.
Thank you, Chandran.
That's Ali, thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us all the way from Hong Kong. We'll hope to have you soon back on BRI Dialogues.